Today I'll be focusing on the events that took place following the Kundalini Awakening I described in my last video. If you haven't watched that one yet, I do recommend viewing it first because the context is important for understanding this one. I spent the week following my awakening trying to reach that same expanded state, but as I said in my last video, I couldn't really progress any further. Night after night, I would enter deep meditation and once again attempt to flood my lower centers with this energy, but I just kept hitting a brick wall and felt completely depleted overall. After sufficient rest, there were nights where I was able to achieve the now familiar inflating sensation throughout my lower chakras, but no matter what I tried, I just couldn't move beyond this stage. I began to feel as if the full Kundalini expansion was possibly just a one-off, and although I felt quite disheartened by this, I was still extremely grateful for what I'd experienced. I began to wonder what else could be possible. What other states of consciousness could I explore and experience? Whenever I had free time throughout the day, I continued studying and practiced channeling energy to each of my chakras, and learned for myself that each chakra seemed to have what felt like a release state that could be physically felt. For instance, if I channeled energy into my throat chakra via my breathing technique, my throat would physically feel as if it was expanding to 3 or 4 times its actual size. Using my breathing technique, it felt quite similar to blowing up a balloon, and while experimenting, I would sometimes feel overcome with a sense of derealization as my consciousness began to incorporate previously unknown sensory data. Whenever I attempted to speak during these experiments, I felt my voice within and felt as if I could perceive other dimensions present in the words I spoke. The words or sounds I verbally spoke seemed to represent only the tip of the iceberg. While meditating in an average seated position, after I'd sufficiently relaxed and cleared my mind, I noticed my head would start to turn towards the right-hand side of the room, as if magnetically drawn to this direction. I don't really understand why this would be the case, but it happened often following the Kundalini Awakening. I wasn't sure if it was really relevant to anything, but this was a very odd sensation. I continued my practices each night, and after approximately 1 month, I'm not exactly sure how long actually, I began to experience something I'd never experienced prior. The following sequence of events I will now describe led to what I can only term as a crown awakening. Day 1. I started to feel a slight pressure across my entire forehead. While focusing on this pressure, it seemed to intensify a little. At the time I was confused and struggled to make sense of this, but something about the development triggered a sense of excitement, knowing it was likely related to the Kundalini Awakening and all the energy work I'd done prior. Day 2. The pressure continued to grow and felt as if it carried more weight and gravity. I also began to notice the pressure wasn't static, as it seemed to almost swish from left to right across the span of my entire forehead. It somewhat reminded me of dense water vapor being moved gently by a subtle current of air in a rhythmic left to right motion. And I'm not sure if this is related or not, but my left nostril also seemed to feel less restricted. It could be unrelated, but I'm only mentioning this because I've never really been able to breathe through it unless I was feeling adrenaline or something like that. But during my evening meditation, it felt completely clear and easy to breathe through. Day 3. The pressure across my forehead that at first reminded me of water vapor seemed to condense and felt more like actual water in its weight and in its motion. By this point, I was absolutely certain I was moving towards something huge, so I began to dedicate more and more time to meditation and the exploration of this peculiar inner phenomena. Day 4. The pressure continued to grow, and the motion of this inner water-like energy began to feel more and more physical. What started out as just a mild, unusual pressure or sense of gravity began to feel more physical than my own body. Day 5. The pressure in my forehead began to spread towards the crown, and by the end of the evening, it had spread throughout my entire skull, but it was still mostly concentrated along my forehead. Whenever I'd focus on these sensations in meditation, I started to feel somewhat unnerved as the pressure seemed to be becoming more sensitive to the attention I placed upon it. Day 6. The pressure continued to grow and intensify. It no longer mattered if I was in a deep meditative state or just in regular day-to-day waking consciousness. I started feeling the water grow heavier and the motion began to feel even more pronounced. The pressure started to feel similar to the pressure I've felt whenever I've swam deep underwater, but with added gravity. In fact, the motion of this energy reminded me of the ebb and flow of an ocean. Whenever I focused on these sensations in deep meditation, my skull began to feel as if it was made from tough rubber, instead of bone. Around the same time, I also started to feel what I can only describe as these spike-like objects descend into my crown and forehead, but since my skull felt rubbery at this level, it seemed to prevent these strange spike-like objects from penetrating my skull. This was very eerie and indistinguishable from something physically being driven into my skull, and to the degree in which I focused, I would feel these spike-like objects burrow deeper and deeper into my skull, as if they were a component of my own awareness, or perhaps a symptom of my resistance. The more I focused, the more I could feel this bizarre pressure increase exponentially. And it really does sound silly now, but at the time, I felt worried my head would implode. I can actually remember unlocking my phone, Googling whether or not spontaneous human combustion was a thing. And I don't think it is, by the way. There you go. Day 7. It didn't take me long to realise the needle sensations I described weren't really anything to worry about, as they were present on and off throughout the entire day, even in regular waking consciousness. Intuitively, I began to understand that I needed to surrender to this experience and allow it to unfold similar to how I did with the initial Kundalini Awakening. During meditation, I again attempted to surrender to the process as I felt these needle or spikes crushing down into my crown and forehead, but despite the courage I was able to muster beforehand, I still could not take the final leap and just allow the experience to unfold. And I know it may sound somewhat cowardly, but this inner phenomena truly felt more vivid than anything I could ever feel in the physical. Regardless of any fear or my reservations, I was still determined to see this through to its conclusion. Day 8. The pressure I felt throughout my skull continued to intensify dramatically, and this is when I started to feel extremely afraid and concerned that I might be causing irreparable damage. I remember frantically searching for accounts similar to my own on Google, but couldn't really find anything at all. That's a huge reason why I wanted to share this account, because it's been unlike any of the accounts I've read prior. At times, my eyes felt as if they were about to be sucked into or pushed out of my skull. The pressure was becoming absolutely unbearable. I really can't describe just how intense this pressure was. I've never felt anything remotely like this before. Imagine the mountain from Game of Thrones attempting to crush your skull with his bare hands, and you're close, but that's a bad example, but it's really not an exaggeration. Later that evening after meditation, I laid down in bed and continued trying to progress, but being as exhausted as I was, I accidentally fell asleep and ended up having a really odd dream. In this dream, I was laying in bed with my wife. The bedroom seemed twice the size, and the furniture was arranged a little differently. We were talking about something, but I can't really remember what we were talking about. I do remember looking towards the bedroom window and noticed the glass was starting to crack. But before I could say anything, the glass exploded and all our furniture started flying out of the window. The covers got ripped from us and I felt myself being dragged out by this mysterious force. For some reason, instead of grabbing my arms to prevent me from being dragged out, my wife bit down onto my fingers. In the dream, I just said, "I'll just let go," because it really hurt. And I woke up the next morning trying to make sense of it all. Day 10. The intense pressure was quickly becoming unbearable and unmanageable. The severity of this pressure became constant regardless of whether or not I was actively practicing or focusing on the experience. During my evening meditation, I actually became quite irrational and scared as I was faced with the reality of just how little I trusted in myself and my own abilities. It was as if everything I had previously found security in began to crumble away. The gravity of this situation nearly pushed me over the edge. My internal dialogue at the time was like, what have I done? How am I supposed to live like this? What if I go mad? What if I already am mad? The fact I couldn't go back was extremely sobering, and in response to this, my body started trembling almost violently, and I once again grew concerned for my sanity as I imagined all the possible worst case scenarios. My hands went cold with shock, and at one point I could barely feel my physical body at all. It felt completely numb and secondary. After feeling this for what felt like an hour, and enduring this storm of doubt, decided to pull out my phone, put my headphones on, and I played one of my favourite anime instrumental playlists, and this helped calm me down and gain a little perspective. You'd probably laugh if you saw some of these playlists, but it really did help. After a while, I remember thinking something along the lines of, well, I'm still here, and I actually tried to find humour in my predicament. I quickly felt whatever was left of this fearful mindset gradually recede, and after regaining my courage, I allowed myself to slip deeper and deeper into a trance state. And when I felt ready, I stopped struggling and thought, oh, fuck it, to myself. And in that moment, I somehow managed to let everything go. The inner sensations I associated with skull pressure continued to intensify once again. It felt more and more like the insides of my head was going to end up decorating the walls or something, but I still managed to retain my sense of balance and renewed hope. And then it finally happened. With an almost audible, organic sounding inner pop or a crack, I suddenly felt as if someone had smashed the top of my skull with a toffee hammer. I felt as if the upper portion of my skull had been completely shattered. Immediately following this moment, I felt as if I was suspended in the cold and vastness of space. My singular point of focused awareness started to feel more peripheral and far more encompassing in nature. I felt my environment as if it was an extension of myself, and I quickly slipped into an unusual and blissful state of tranquility. I once again felt my consciousness expand, reminding me of what I experienced when the Kundalini energy first reached my crown during the initial awakening. As my consciousness continued to expand, I felt as if someone had physically sliced into the center, top part of my brain, creating what felt like a flap or opening. The sensation of this opening felt similar to stretching open a fresh cut with 2 fingers. There was a little pain and discomfort, but I knew intuitively this was nothing to worry about. When I focused on this newly formed opening at the top of my skull, I felt it expand in response to my curiosity and attention, and I gradually became aware of a huge channel above me, connected to a triangular pyramid or cone-like object that seemed to be gently rotating and bobbing up and down as if it was floating on the surface of a body of water. Even though this object felt as if it was outside of me, it also felt like it was part of my inner self. This frame-like object felt as if it was high above, but also very close. It was very paradoxical in how it felt. I'm not really certain if it was a pyramid or a cone, since it was felt and not really seen, and by felt I mean like touch data. My head also felt as if it was no longer subject to gravity. Again, this is very difficult to describe, but I really am trying my hardest to describe all this in physical terms. Even my face felt as if it was no longer being affected by gravity. This was actually quite a pleasant feeling. It kind of reminded me how loose and comfortable my skin always feels after sitting out in the sun for a while. The experience intensified the more I was able to trust, surrender, and allow it all to unfold. I would also randomly feel this cone or pyramid frame-like object that seemed so high above me descend, until it felt as if it was perched and rotating above the roof of my mouth, like a spinning top almost. This reminded me of the sensation I felt when I had a tooth extraction a couple of years ago. Not the extraction itself, but the numbing injection they administer to the roof of the mouth. Now, after the events of day 10, I wrote the following in my diary. In terms of what I have experienced with this energy so far, there's an increased awareness of something. I don't like being so vague, but I don't quite know how to convey or describe certain aspects of this experience. I'm definitely not going to sit here and say that I experienced enlightenment following the events I've described, because that wasn't and hasn't been the case. In many ways, I am just as clueless now as I ever was before. I will say that I have felt more present and more capable of expressing myself in ways I struggled to before. But even that in itself could be a result of being more mindful and inwardly focused in recent years. I feel somewhat displaced going about my regular daily routine in response to all of this. This experience hasn't been what I imagined or expected so far. I feel the presence of the frame and the channel above me, and I am vaguely aware of the space above my head, even in regular waking consciousness. When the channel above is open, it feels as if I can draw energy down, and whenever I attempt to send energy upwards, it seems to widen the channel, which makes it feel less restricted. The energy I breathe down seems to have an emotional quality to it. It is very loving, peaceful, tranquil, and relaxing. At this point, I do not want to really speculate as to what this energy is, or even speculate where this experience is going, as I think that could perhaps limit the expression of this in the long term. When uncentered, I am feeling an intense voltage running through my teeth, which makes them feel quite sore, as if they're being forced apart. There's obviously no sign of this physically, however, so it may just be the energy interacting with the nerves in the teeth themselves. This is very difficult to shake and has been happening quite often, especially in the evening when I try and sleep. It almost feels like a field or structure has slipped down, containing my teeth within this field of energy, and it's very uncomfortable at times. In my next video, I'd like to discuss the changes I experienced as noted in my diary entries, without pushing my beliefs about reality onto you, because that really isn't my intention in sharing what I have so far. This is why I try and describe my experience purely from a sensory perspective, and I speak very little of the realizations I've experienced along the way. Maybe I will make videos about this later. It's quite difficult for me to determine what is appropriate in this regard and what isn't. I will say that I believe if there's currently 7.8 billion people alive on Earth right now, I believe there's essentially 7.8 billion different truths, in the sense that we each seem to create our own realities in accordance with our personal beliefs, emotions, and attitudes. The structures of our many belief systems may differ wildly, but if you are living in alignment with your own inner self, you are living in truth regardless of whichever system of belief enables your truth to be expressed.